The rain that never stopped. It was a cold evening in Los Angeles, the kind of night when the sky couldn't decide whether to cry or stay silent. The rain fell softly at first, then harder, soaking the empty streets outside a quiet cafe. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, one man stood waiting, his hair damp, his jacket clinging to his shoulders. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't there for a premiere, not for a photo shoot, not for fame. He was waiting for someone he hadn't seen in years. Sandra Bullock. They had agreed to meet at this very spot, a small place hidden away from flashing cameras and crowded rooms. No one knew about it but them. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, where honesty felt safe. The rain had been falling for over an hour now, and still, she hadn't come. Keanu checked his phone, but there were no messages. He could have gone home, called his driver, or waited inside where it was warm. But he stayed. His shoes were soaked, his hands cold, yet he didn't move. Because sometimes, waiting isn't about hope, it's about loyalty. A passerby stopped and recognized him, surprised. "You're Keanu Reeves. Are you okay?" He smiled gently, water dripping from his hair. "I'm fine," he said softly, "just waiting for someone important." The stranger nodded, unsure what to say, and left. Keanu looked back toward the road again, eyes calm, but heavy with thought. He remembered the first time he and Sandra met, the laughter between takes, the way her kindness made even the hardest days brighter. Years had passed since then, but some bonds don't fade, they just grow quieter. The rain kept falling, harder now. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away. Still, he didn't move. His phone buzzed once, a text. He opened it quickly. "Keanu, I'm so sorry. I'm running late. Traffic, please don't leave." He smiled softly. "I'm not going anywhere." He typed back. People inside the cafe looked out the window, whispering to each other as they watched him. They didn't see a movie star that night. They saw a man, patient, gentle, and humble. The kind of man who still believed that promises meant something. Minutes turned to an hour. The rain grew colder. Yet Keanu didn't complain. He leaned against the wall, looking up at the gray sky. Maybe he was thinking about how rare it is to find people who truly matter. Or maybe he was remembering all the times life had taught him to wait, for peace, for healing, for understanding. And when the cafe lights began to flicker, a car finally stopped nearby. A familiar voice called out through the rain, "Keanu." He looked up, and for the first time that night, he smiled fully, the kind of smile that carried relief, warmth, and something deeper. Because sometimes, waiting in the rain isn't about time. It's about love that never gave up. When she finally Aravet's car door opened, and through the falling rain, Sandra Bullock stepped out. Her hair was slightly damp, her coat darkened by raindrops. She ran toward him, her heels splashing in the puddles. "Keanu," she said, breathless, her voice trembling. "You're soaked. Why didn't you wait inside?" He smiled softly, rain still dripping from his hair. "I said I'd wait here. I meant it." For a moment, she just looked at him, speechless. Her eyes softened, but her guilt was clear. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly, "but I wanted to." They stood there under the streetlight, both wet, both silent. It wasn't just the rain that made the moment heavy. It was everything that had been left unsaid for years. She finally said, "You always do this." "Do what?" he asked. "You keep waiting for people who forget how to stay." Keanu looked at her for a long time. "Maybe I don't wait for people," he said softly. "Maybe I wait for peace. And sometimes peace looks like someone you once cared about." Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "You haven't changed," she said. "Neither have you," he replied. "You still apologize for things you don't need to." They both laughed softly, a fragile sound beneath the storm. The cafe door opened, and a waiter called out, "Sir, ma'am, please come inside before you catch a cold." They finally stepped in, shaking off the rain. The warmth of the room wrapped around them. Soft music played, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Sandra sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, trying to stop them from shaking. "So," she said, looking at him, "after all these years, why now?" Keanu took a slow breath. "Because there are some things you shouldn't leave unfinished." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "Goodbyes," he said, "and forgiveness." Her face changed slightly. She looked down at her cup, remembering a time long ago, a misunderstanding that had once pulled them apart. She had said something during a press event that hurt him, though she hadn't meant to. It wasn't cruel, just careless. But Keanu, who always valued quiet sincerity, had taken it to heart. They never really spoke about it after. They just drifted away. I thought you moved on, she said softly. I did, he said. But moving on doesn't mean forgetting. Sometimes it just means remembering without pain. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain outside softened, turning into a gentle drizzle. She looked at him and said quietly, "You waited in the rain for me, Keanu. Maybe you're the only person who still believes people are worth waiting for." He smiled gently. "Maybe I just believe in second chances." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Then maybe we both needed this one, and for the first time in years." The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. The truth she couldn't hide anymore. The cafe had grown quieter. The rain had slowed to a whisper against the windows, and the last few customers were getting ready to leave. But Keanu and Sandra remained seated, the cups of coffee long gone cold between them, for a while. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. There was something gentle about the silence, as if both were afraid that words might break the fragile calm they had finally found. Then Sandra took a deep breath. "Keanu," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, "there's a reason I asked to meet tonight." He looked up, sensing the shift in her tone. "I thought you just wanted to catch up." She smiled faintly. "Partly, yes. But that's not all." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Do you remember that charity event? The one after our second movie together? I told you I couldn't stay long because I had a family emergency." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I remember. You left early. You looked scared." Her eyes glistened. "It wasn't just a family emergency. It was about me." His expression softened. "What happened?" She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "I found out that night that I had a health issue. Nothing life-threatening now, but back then, it was serious. I didn't want anyone to know. Not the media, not friends, not even you. I was afraid if I told you, you'd look at me differently." Keanu leaned forward, his eyes filled with quiet concern. "Sandra," she continued before he could speak, "I pushed you away on purpose after that night. I told myself it was better if you didn't get involved, if I didn't let you care. I thought distance would make it easier, but instead, it just left this emptiness." He sat there, stunned, not angry, not hurt, just deeply moved. "You thought you were protecting me," he said quietly. "I thought I was protecting myself," she replied, "because everyone leaves when things get heavy. I didn't want you to carry my storm." His voice was calm but steady. "You should have known by now. I don't run from storms." She looked up at him, tears finally escaping. "I know. I realize that now. And when I saw that video of you waiting in the rain for someone, it felt like life had come full circle. I knew I couldn't hide anymore." He smiled gently, the kind of smile that carried warmth through pain. "You didn't have to hide, Sandra. Not from me. I would have waited through any storm, not just the rain." For a long moment, she just stared at him, letting his words sink in. Then she whispered, "Maybe that's why I came back. Not to explain the past, but to see if you still meant what you said. That kindness doesn't end even when people walk separate paths." He nodded slowly. "It doesn't. Not when it's real." Outside, the clouds began to break apart, revealing a few faint stars through the night sky. Sandra looked out the window and smiled through her tears. The rains finally stopped. She said softly, "Yeah," Keanu replied, "but sometimes it needs to rain first before everything feels clear again." And for the first time in years, both of them felt that clarity, the kind that comes not from closure, but from forgiveness. The pain he never spoke. A booth cafe was almost empty now. The waiter wiped tables quietly, the lights dimmed softer, and the sound of the rain had faded into memory. Keanu and Sandra were still there, lost in the kind of conversation that only happens when time feels irrelevant. After her confession, Sandra felt lighter. It was as if years of silence had finally lifted off her chest. But she could tell something in Keanu's eyes had changed too, not with judgment, but with deep reflection, like he was holding something he wasn't ready to say. "You're quiet," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. "About how pain connects people more than words ever could." She looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" He leaned back slightly, his voice low. "You know, everyone sees the movies, the interviews, the calm face. They think I'm peaceful because I'm strong. But most days, peace is something I chase, not something I have." Her expression softened. You've been through a lot, haven't you? He nodded slowly. Loss doesn't really leave you. It just changes shape. Sandra stayed quiet, letting him speak, something he rarely did about himself. There was a time, he said slowly, when I thought love was meant to heal everything. But after losing people I loved, I realized love doesn't erase pain. It teaches you how to live with it. I've waited for people who never came back, and I've forgiven those who never said sorry. I think that's why I waited for you tonight. Not because I expected anything, but because waiting sometimes feels like the only way I know how to love. His voice broke slightly at the end. Sandra blinked hard, fighting back her tears. Keanu, she whispered, you shouldn't have to carry everything alone. He looked at her gently. I'm not alone now. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had both survived. Finally, Sandra reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. You waited in the rain for me, she said softly. But maybe you've been standing in the rain your whole life, waiting for someone to see you. He looked down, then back at her, his eyes wet but calm. Maybe, he said quietly, and maybe that's okay, because sometimes the rain reminds you you're still alive. Her lips trembled as she whispered, you're the kindest person I've ever known. He smiled, a little sad, a little grateful. And you're the one who reminds me that kindness still matters. The waiter came by, gently asking if they needed anything else. Both shook their heads. It was late now. Outside, the night was still and quiet, the kind of peace that feels earned as they stood to leave. Sandra looked at him one last time before stepping out into the cool air. You waited for me in the rain, she said. Maybe now it's my turn to wait for you in the light. He smiled softly. Then maybe the rain was worth it, and for the first time, he didn't look tired anymore. He looked whole. Asterisk when the world saw what love really means the next morning. Sandra woke up to sunlight streaming through her window. The rain had stopped, and the city looked cleaner, softer, as if the storm had washed away more than just dust. She sat up slowly, still thinking about last night, the look in Keanu's eyes, the honesty in his words, the quiet strength he carried even in pain. She hadn't planned to see him again so soon, but something inside her refused to let things stay unfinished. There was more she needed to say, and something she needed to do. Meanwhile, Keanu spent his morning at a small community shelter he often visited quietly. No cameras, no interviews, just him helping serve breakfast to people who had no one else. It was his way of staying grounded. One volunteer smiled and said, "You're always here, rain or shine." He smiled back gently. Everyone deserves a little light. Later that day, as he stepped outside, he saw a familiar car waiting by the curb. The window rolled down. It was Sandra. She waved. "Get in," she said with that familiar half-smile. Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. "You planning a kidnapping?" "Maybe," she teased, "but only for a good reason." He got in, and they drove quietly through the city until they reached a quiet spot, a children's rehabilitation center. Sandra parked the car and turned to him. "I've been working with this place for a while," she said softly. "I wanted to come today, and I wanted you with me, inside." They spent the afternoon talking with children, reading to them, and helping paint a small wall mural together. The kids laughed when Keanu got paint on his hands. One little girl asked him, "Are you a superhero?" He smiled warmly. "No," he said softly, "but I've met a few." He glanced at Sandra as he said it, and she smiled back, a quiet, knowing smile. When they finished, Sandra surprised him again. She spoke to the staff and made a donation in both their names. For the kids who never stopped believing in hope, she said. As they left, Keanu looked at her, his eyes bright with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged gently. "Maybe not, but last night you reminded me that love isn't about waiting for someone to show up. It's about showing up for others, too." He stopped walking for a moment, watching her. "You've always had that strength," he said softly. "You just forgot it for a while." She turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. "And you've always had that heart, Keanu. You just needed someone to remind you it still beats for something bigger than pain." They both smiled. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. Not clearly. It was something deeper. A connection that went beyond words, built on years of trust, loss, and rediscovery. But the world wasn't done watching them. The next day, photos of them painting the wall with children spread across social media. People called it the most beautiful reunion of the year. But what touched everyone wasn't the fame. It was the look in their eyes. The kind of quiet warmth no acting could fake. For once, the world didn't gossip. It listened. And in that rare silence, people saw what love really looked like. Not glamour, not perfection, but kindness shared in the rain and the sunlight that followed. Asterisk, the reason he waited a few weeks later, Los Angeles was calm again. The world had stopped talking, the noise had faded, and everything between Keanu and Sandra had settled into a quiet peace. They still met often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just a walk by the beach. There was no script between them, no cameras, only two souls who finally understood each other in silence. But one evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky gold, Sandra noticed something different in Keanu's eyes. They were calm, but distant, like he had something heavy sitting quietly inside him. They were sitting on a wooden bench overlooking the water when she finally asked, "Keanu, can I ask you something? That night when you waited in the rain, was it really just because I was late?" He looked out toward the horizon, the ocean shimmering in the last light of day. For a while, he didn't answer. Then he said softly, "No, not really." She turned to him, surprised. "Then why?" He smiled faintly, his voice low and gentle. "Years ago, when we first worked together, you told me something I never forgot. You said the hardest part about being in this business is that people stop waiting for you. Everyone's in a rush, always chasing the next thing. But you waited for people. You listened. You cared. And I realized that night in the rain, I wanted to be the kind of person who would wait for someone the way you always did for others." His eyes glistened as he continued, "I wasn't waiting for you to show up. I was waiting for a promise I made to myself that I would never let this world make me cold. I waited to prove that love, in any form, still matters." Sandra's breath caught. She had always known his heart was rare, but hearing those words broke something open inside her. Tears welled in her eyes. "Keanu," she whispered, "you always think love is something you give to others, but you deserve it too. You've spent your whole life waiting for someone else to be okay. Maybe it's time someone waits for you." He looked at her quietly, the corner of his mouth lifting in that familiar, gentle smile. "Maybe," he said, "but you being here, that's enough." They both turned back to the sea. The wind brushed softly between them, carrying the scent of rain in the distance. The world felt still again, like it was listening. After a long pause, Sandra said, "You know, people think love is about grand gestures, but it's not. It's about the quiet ones, the moments when no one's watching, the choices no one talks about." He nodded slowly. "The waiting in the rain." She smiled through her tears. "Exactly." As the sky darkened, the first few drops of rain began to fall again, soft, gentle, like the world remembering. Keanu stood and opened his jacket, holding it over her head. She laughed, shaking her head. "You never learn, do ya? Some things are worth getting wet for," he said with a small grin. She looked at him then, really looked, and understood. This wasn't a man waiting for love. This was love, waiting in human form. And in that moment, under the same rain that had once separated them, the hearts that had waited a lifetime finally found peace, not in confession, but in understanding. Because sometimes love doesn't need to begin again. It just needs to be seen.